Sometimes a man reaches a point where he has nothing left to lose, except his honor. When that happens, even the most dangerous enemies become just obstacles in his path. In the dark woods of Skarnfjell, a group of outlaws thinks they control everything that moves through their territory. They've grown rich, robbing travelers and killing anyone who resists. Today, a giant named Rurik walks straight into their trap. The outlaws surround him with weapons drawn, expecting another easy victim. But this weathered warrior shows no fear. Their leader steps forward to make his usual threats. Then, a deep growl comes from the shadows. A massive wolf emerges from the trees, her eyes burning like ice. This isn't just any beast, this is Fenja, and she belongs to the giant. But how did one man earn such loyalty from a creature of legend? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra, special for you. The morning mist clung to the ancient pines of Skarnfjell like the breath of forgotten gods, and Rurik Holmgersen moved through it as quietly as his massive frame would allow. His weathered hands rested on the worn leather straps of his travel pack, a simple thing that had carried him across countless leagues, its surface scarred by years of hard living. Inside, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, lay items that spoke of a different life. Carved bone tokens bearing noble runes, a small silver amulet that had belonged to his mother, and papers that proved a lineage he could no longer claim. The pack had been his constant companion for 15 years, ever since the night his world burned. On that terrible evening, when he was barely 20 summers old, Rurik had learned what it meant to lose everything that mattered. His father's hall, his family's honor, his promised future as a jarl, all of it had vanished in blood and flame, leaving him with nothing but the clothes on his back and a wounded wolf pup he'd found whimpering in the ashes. That pup was Fenja, and she padded beside him now through the morning shadows, her silver collar catching the filtered sunlight. The collar was older than either of them, crafted by his grandmother's hands when the old woman still believed the ancient ways held power. Nordic protection runes ran around its circumference, symbols that most men dismissed as superstition, but which seemed to pulse with their own inner light when danger drew near. Fenja had grown into something magnificent and terrible, standing nearly as tall as a man's waist, her coat the color of winter storms, her eyes like pale fire in the gloom. Their bond had been forged in shared grief and mutual salvation. On that night when his family died, young Rurik had stumbled through the burning ruins of his father's great hall, calling desperately for survivors. He'd found Fenja trapped beneath a fallen beam, her leg broken, her mother dead. Beside her, perhaps it was destiny, or perhaps it was simple kindness, but Rurik had freed the pup and carried her into the wilderness. They'd healed together, learned to hunt together, learned to trust only each other in a world that had shown them both its cruelest face. The years that followed had shaped Rurik into something harder than the soft young noble he'd once been. He'd wandered the northern lands as masterless man, taking what honest work he could find, avoiding the courts where his true name might be recognized. His size and skill with weapons made him valuable as a guard or a warrior for hire, but his principles often put him at odds with employers who cared little for honor. He'd learned to read men's hearts as clearly as he read weather signs, and he discovered that the world held far more darkness than the sheltered life of his youth had prepared him for. Skarnfjell had long been a place where such darkness gathered. The region lay between three jarls, territories, and none of them claimed it strongly enough to impose real law. Ancient pine forests stretched for days in every direction, broken only by rushing streams and hidden valleys where a man could disappear forever. The main road through the region was little more than a hunter's path, winding through terrain that favored ambush over honest travel. It was perfect territory for men like Grim Bloodaxe and his band. Grim had claimed these woods 5 years ago, after fleeing from justice in the eastern settlements. He'd been a Jarl's man once, a warrior of some reputation, but his taste for cruelty had eventually exceeded even his lord's tolerance. When he'd finally gone too far, violating a merchant's daughter under the protection of guest right, he'd been outlawed and marked for death. Instead of facing judgment with honor, he'd gathered other outcasts and fled to Skarnfjell. The band that followed Grim included the worst sorts of men, oath-breakers, who'd fled there. Lords, murderers who'd escaped justice, thieves who'd grown too bold for civilized lands. They'd carved out a brutal kingdom in the deep woods, taking everything that passed through their territory and killing anyone who resisted. Merchants who'd once used the old road now traveled dangerous alternate routes, adding weeks to their journeys rather than face the outlaws' depredations. Grim himself was a man of medium height but broad build, his arms thick with muscle earned through years of violence. His beard was streaked with premature grey, and his eyes held the flat emptiness that came from years of killing without conscience. He wore stolen mail and carried weapons taken from his victims, but his greatest prize was an ornate battle-axe that seemed to drink light from the air around it. Local whispers claimed the weapon was cursed, that it grew stronger with each life it took, but Grim cared little for superstition as long as it served his purposes. His second-in-command was a giant named Eric the Bone Crusher, a man who'd earned his name through a preference for breaking his enemies rather than simply killing them. Eric stood half a head taller than most men and carried a warhammer that could shatter shields like kindling. Beside him often stood Sven One-Eye, who'd lost half his sight to a merchant's desperate knife thrust, but had gained a reputation for tracking fleeing victims through any terrain. These men and a dozen others like them had made Skarnfjell a place of fear and whispered warnings. They lived like kings in their forest domain, taking what they pleased and answering to no law but Grim's will. They'd grown comfortable in their power, confident that their reputation would keep all but the most desperate travelers away. But reputation was a double-edged weapon, and Rurik's own legend had grown in the telling over the years. In the alehouses and trading posts of the northern settlements, men spoke in hushed tones of the giant of the roads, a masterless warrior who travelled with a wolf the size of a horse and asked no man's permission to walk where he would. Some claimed he was the ghost of an ancient hero, others that he was touched by the old gods themselves. The truth was simpler and more complex. He was a man who'd lost everything except his principles, and who'd learned that sometimes principles were all a man needed. Rurik had heard whispers of Grim's band during his travels, had seen the fear in merchants' eyes when they spoke of the Skarnfjell road. He'd chosen this path deliberately, drawn by something deeper than mere wanderlust. Perhaps it was the memory of his father's teachings about a lord's duty to protect the innocent. Perhaps it was simply that he'd grown tired of seeing evil prosper while good men suffered. As he walked deeper into the morning shadows, Fenja's ears pricked forward with sudden alertness. Her nose tested the air, cataloguing scents that human senses couldn't detect. Rurik's hand moved, instinctively, to the worn leather grip of his father's sword, though he didn't draw it. The weapon had been the only thing of real value he'd carried from his family's burning hall, its blade inscribed with runes that matched those on Fenja's collar. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, as if the ancient trees themselves sensed what was coming. Somewhere ahead, through the mist and shadows, Grim Bloodaxe waited with his band of killers, confident in his power and ignorant of the storm that approached. They'd grown used to facing desperate merchants and frightened travelers, men whose courage failed when faced with drawn steel. Today they would learn that some storms couldn't be turned aside by threats or reputation. Today they would discover that the giant of the roads was more than legend, and that the wolf who walked beside him carried the old powers in her blood. Rurik's weathered face showed no emotion as he continued along the forest path, but his eyes held the steady calm of a man who'd found his purpose at last. Behind them, the morning mist swirled and eddied, as if disturbed by forces that had nothing to do with wind. The ancient woods of Skarnfjell were about to witness something they hadn't seen in generations, the return of justice to a place where it had been forgotten too long. The ambush came at the narrowest part of the trail, where ancient oaks pressed close on both sides and their gnarled roots forced the path into a series of tight turns. Rurik had expected it, had felt the wrongness in the air for the past quarter-mile, but he walked into it anyway, with the steady gait of a man who'd faced worse odds and lived to tell about it. They emerged from behind trees and boulders like wolves emerging from their den, 8 men with weapons already drawn, their faces bearing the hard stamps of violence and easy cruelty. At their center stood grim Bloodaxe himself, his cursed weapon resting against his shoulder with casual confidence. The morning light seemed to bend strangely around the axe's blade, as if the metal drank illumination the way sand drank water. "Well, well," Grim said, his voice carrying the rough accent of the eastern settlements. "What do we have wandering our road this fine morning?" His eyes took in Rurik's size, with the practiced assessment of a man who'd sized up countless victims. "You're a big one, aren't you? That'll make the sport more interesting." Rurik stopped walking but didn't reach for his sword. Fenja padded to his side, her pale eyes fixed on the outlaws with predatory intensity. Several of the men shifted nervously at the sight of her, but Grim only laughed. "And you've brought your dog along? How thoughtful my boys get hungry after a hard day's work." He gestured with his free hand, and the outlaws began to spread out in a loose semicircle. "Now then, big man, here's how this works. You hand over that pretty sword and whatever coin you're carrying, and maybe we'll make it quick. Give us trouble, and we'll take our time with you." "This road belongs to no man," Rurik said quietly. His voice carried the calm authority of someone accustomed to command, though few would have recognized the accent of noble breeding beneath years of hard living. Grim's eyes narrowed at the response. Most travelers begged or tried to bargain by this point. This giant's composure was unusual, and unusual things made Grim suspicious. "Everything in Skarnfjell belongs to me, stranger. The trees, the streams, the very air you breathe. And anyone who wants to use what's mine pays the toll." As he spoke, Grim absently twisted a ring on his finger, a heavy band of gold bearing an elaborate seal. Rurik's eyes fixed on it with sudden intensity, his weathered face going very still. The ring bore the device of a wolf's head beneath a crown of stars, the personal seal of Jarl Thorvald Holmgerson, the seal of his murdered father. For a moment, time seemed suspended. In the forest clearing, the morning breeze stilled, the distant bird calls faded, and even the outlaws seemed to sense that something significant had shifted in their prey. Rurik's breathing remained steady, but his hands had begun to tremble not with fear, but with the kind of rage that burned too hot for immediate expression. "Where did you get that ring?" The question came out soft as silk and twice as dangerous. Grim glanced down at his finger and grinned. "This old thing? Took it off a fat jarl about 15 years back. Thought he could buy his life with pretty words about honor and duty." His grin widened, showing teeth yellowed by poor living. "Learned different, didn't he? Burned real pretty, his haul did. Him and his whole family." The words hit Rurik like physical blows, each syllable confirming what the ring had already told him. This man, this laughing animal before him, had been there the night his world ended, had perhaps struck the killing blow that ended his. The father's life, had watched his mother and sisters burn. Fenja sensed the change in her companion instantly. Her hackles rose and a low growl began deep in her chest, not the warning sound of a domestic dog, but something far more primal. The outlaws took unconscious steps backward as the wolf's eyes seemed to catch fire in the morning light. "Something wrong, big man?" Grim's voice held mock concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost. Don't worry, you'll be joining plenty of them soon enough." He raised the cursed axe and took a step forward. "Boys, I think our friend here needs some convincing. The outlaw to Rurik's left moved first, lunging with a rusty sword aimed at the giant's ribs. It was a clumsy attack, born of overconfidence and too many easy victories against helpless merchants. Rurik moved with fluid grace that belied his size, sidestepping the thrust and bringing his elbow down on the attacker's extended wrist. Bone cracked like dry kindling, and the outlaw's scream shattered the morning quiet as his weapon tumbled from nerveless fingers. Before the man had even hit the ground, Rurik was in motion again. His massive hands closed around the broken-wristed outlaw's throat and belt, and he lifted the screaming man overhead like a child's toy. For a heartbeat he held the pose, demonstrating strength that went beyond mere human muscle, then hurled the outlaw into two of his companions with bone-jarring force. The remaining outlaws hesitated, suddenly uncertain. This wasn't how their ambushes usually went. Victims were supposed to cower and plead, not move like trained warriors, and throw grown men around like sacks of grain. That hesitation cost them dearly. Fenja struck like winter lightning, covering the distance to the nearest outlaw in a single bound. Her jaws closed around the man's sword arm with crushing force, and her weight bore him to the ground as he shrieked in terror and agony. She was no ordinary wolf, that much was immediately clear. Her size and speed spoke of something beyond nature, something touched by older powers than men generally acknowledged. "Kill them!" Grim roared, finally shaking off his own shock. "Kill them both!" But his remaining men were already breaking. The sight of their companion being savaged by what looked like a creature from legend, combined with Rurik's casual display of inhuman strength, had shattered their nerve. These were bullies and cowards who preyed on the weak. They had no stomach for real battle against opponents who could fight back. Two more outlaws turned and fled into the forest, crashing through underbrush in their haste to escape. A third tried to circle behind Rurik, but found himself facing Fenja's burning gaze as she released her first victim and turned toward him. The man took one look at her blood-stained muzzle and decided that discretion was indeed the better part of valor. In moments, only Grim remained standing in the clearing, his cursed axe held before him like a shield against the advancing giant. The outlaw leader's face had gone pale beneath his weathered tan, but his eyes still held the desperate cunning of a cornered rat. "You think you've won something here?" Grim snarled, backing toward the tree line. "You have no idea what you've started, stranger. No idea what kind of enemy you've made." His fingers tightened on the axe handle, and the weapon seemed to pulse with dark energy. "But you'll learn. Oh, you'll learn." Rurik drew his father's sword for the first time, its blade singing as it cleared the scabbard. Sunlight ran along the steel like liquid fire, and the runes inscribed near the hilt seemed to glow with their own inner light. "I know exactly what I've started," Rurik said, his voice carrying the weight of 15 years' worth of grief and rage. "And I know exactly who you are, Grim Bloodaxe. You and your dogs killed my family, burned my father's hall, stole his ring from his dying hand." Grim's eyes widened as understanding finally dawned. "Holmgerson," he breathed, "you're supposed to be dead." "Death would have been a mercy," Rurik replied, advancing step by measured step. "Instead, I've spent 15 years learning how to bring justice to men like you. Today, Father's ring comes home." For a moment it seemed Grim might stand and fight, might let his cursed weapon drink deep of blood and battle. Then Fenja padded up beside Rurik, her muzzle still stained red, her pale eyes promising death to anyone who threatened her companion. The sight of her broke whatever courage the outlaw leader had managed to summon. With a curse that would have made demons blush, Grim turned and fled into the forest, leaving behind his wounded men and his reputation for invincibility. But he carried with him Rurik's father's ring, and more importantly, the knowledge that his past had finally come to claim him. Rurik watched him go without pursuit, but his eyes held the patience of a hunter who knew his prey could not run forever. The outlaw stronghold lay deeper in the forest than most men would dare to travel, hidden in a valley where the ancient pines grew so thick that noon felt like twilight. Rurik and Fenja moved through the shadows like ghosts, following the panicked trail left by Grimm's fleeing men. The outlaws had crashed through underbrush with all the subtlety of wounded bears, leaving broken branches and trampled earth that even a child could have followed. As they drew closer to their destination, Fenja's nose led them to a grisly discovery. Scattered among the roots of a massive oak were the belongings of dozens of victims, travel packs torn open and ransacked, personal items that had meant everything to their owners but nothing to their killers. Rurik knelt beside the pile with the reverence of a man visiting a graveyard, his weathered fingers sorting through the remnants of shattered lives. A child's wooden toy caught his attention, carved in the shape of a horse and worn smooth by small hands. Beside it lay a woman's hair ribbon, its blue silk now faded and stained. Each item told a story of interrupted journeys and families torn apart, and Rurik felt the weight of their silent accusations. But it was the blood-stained ledger hidden beneath the pile that made his jaw clench with renewed rage. The book's leather cover bore the mark of a merchant's guild, but its pages had been repurposed for darker record-keeping. In Grimm's own crude handwriting were lists of victims, their possessions, and the amounts their deaths had enriched the outlaw band. Rurik's hands trembled as he found the entry he'd been dreading: Jarl Thorvald Holmgerson and household burned out, good pickings, gold rings, silver cups, fine weapons. The whelp got away, but winter will finish him. The words blurred as 15-year-old memories crashed over him like a tide. He was 20 again, stumbling through burning halls while calling desperately for his family. He could smell the smoke, hear the screams, feel the heat of flames that had consumed everything he'd ever loved. His father's voice echoing from the great hall, still trying to rally his men even as the roof beams began to fall. His mother's final scream cut short by collapsing timber. Fenja pressed against his side, her warmth anchoring him to the present. She'd been there that night too, a tiny pup trapped beneath the debris that had killed her mother. They'd saved each other in the darkness, two survivors clinging to life in a world gone mad. The memory of that night had shaped everything that followed. Young Rurik had carried the wounded pup into the wilderness, using skills learned from his father's huntsman to find shelter and food. They'd lived like animals those first months, hiding in caves and hollow trees, learning to hunt together as winter closed its grip on the land. The soft, young noble had died in that wilderness, burned away like fat in a forge fire, leaving behind something harder and more dangerous. His father's weapons master had trained him well before the end, teaching him the old fighting techniques passed down through generations of jarls. But it was the wilderness that had taught him patience, cunning, and the kind of strength that came from having nothing left to lose. He'd emerged the following spring as something new, no longer the heir to a great hall, but a weapon forged in grief and tempered by survival. Fenja's low growl brought his attention back to the present. Ahead, through the trees, he could see the smoke of cooking fires and hear the rough voices of men who thought themselves safe in their hidden stronghold. The outlaw camp sprawled across a natural clearing, its crude shelters built from stolen timber and salvaged canvas. Guards walked lazy patrols, confident that their reputation would keep enemies at bay. But as Rurik studied the camp's layout, his tactical mind noted something that made his blood run cold. Near the center of the settlement, a crude wooden cage held a single occupant, a young woman with auburn hair and torn clothing. Even from this distance, he could see the defiant set of her shoulders, the way she held herself despite whatever horrors she'd endured. This changed everything. Rurik's quest for vengeance was his own affair, but an innocent life hung in the balance. The code his father had beaten into him with wooden practice swords demanded that he act, regardless of personal cost. A lord's duty was to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, even if he no longer held lands or title. The woman in the cage had been beautiful once, before fear and rough treatment had left their marks. Her dress bore the fine weaving of merchant-class prosperity, and the way she carried herself suggested education and refinement. How she'd come to be Grim's prisoner hardly mattered. What mattered was getting her out alive. Rurik settled into patient observation, cataloguing guard patterns and counting heads. Fenja lay beside him like a grey shadow, her pale eyes never leaving the camp below. They'd learned this kind of patience together in their years of wandering, the hunter's art of waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As afternoon faded toward evening, he began to piece together the camp's routines. Grim himself held court near a large fire pit, regaling his men with boastful tales of past victories. The outlaw leader seemed to have recovered his composure after the morning's encounter, but Rurik noticed how his hand kept straying to the empty spot where his father's ring should have been. The man was rattled, even if he wouldn't admit it. Near sunset, Rurik heard the woman speak for the first time as one of the outlaws brought her water. Her voice carried the educated accent of the merchant class, but underneath lay steel that impressed him. She wasn't broken yet, despite whatever they'd put her through. "My father will pay any ransom you ask," she said calmly. "But his patience has limits, and his reach is longer than you know." The outlaw laughed and made some crude remark that Rurik couldn't quite hear, but the woman's response carried clearly through the evening air. "Threaten me all you like. I've seen what real monsters look like, and you're just a petty thief with delusions of grandeur." Her courage in the face of such danger reminded Rurik of his own sisters, who'd possessed the same kind of quiet strength. They'd died in the flames 15 years ago, but perhaps he could save this one. Perhaps he could finally do something right. As darkness settled over the forest, Rurik began to formulate a plan. The direct approach that had served him well on the road wouldn't work here. Too many enemies, too much risk to the prisoner. This would require the kind of careful strategy his father had taught him during their chess games in the great hall's warmth. The night would be long, but morning would bring justice to Skarnfjell. And if the gods were kind, it would bring Grim Bloodaxe face to face with the consequences of his crimes. Rurik spent the night hours moving like a shadow around the outlaw camp's perimeter, memorizing every detail that might prove useful when the time came to act. Fenja ghosted beside him, her supernatural senses cataloguing scents and sounds that human awareness couldn't detect. What they discovered in those dark hours changed his understanding of both the enemy he faced and the woman he meant to rescue. The prisoner had not given up hope, despite days of captivity. Through careful observation, Rurik watched her work at the crude rope bonds that held her to the cage's central post. Her movements were subtle, designed to escape notice from the lazy guards, but her fingers showed the methodical persistence of someone with a plan. When she thought no one was looking, she tested the cage's wooden bars with the patience of an engineer examining a structure for weaknesses. More intriguing still was the pendant that hung around her neck, a simple thing of silver and amber that most would dismiss as common jewelry. But in the moonlight filtering through the forest canopy, Rurik noticed it gave off the faintest glow, like a coal banked for the night. His grandmother's teachings stirred in his memory, lessons about the old ways that most folk had forgotten. Such items were markers of bloodlines that carried older gifts, families that had never fully abandoned the ancient paths. The woman, Astrid, he'd learned from listening to the outlaw's crude conversation, came from merchant stock, but not the common sort. Her family traded in more than simple goods. They carried knowledge, connections, and apparently the kind of heritage that still mattered in the deep places of the world. That would explain her courage and the way she seemed to command respect even from her captors. As dawn approached, Rurik retreated to a hidden vantage point where he could observe without being seen. His tactical mind had been working through the night, weighing options and calculating risks. The direct assault that had served him on the road would be suicide here, too many enemies, too much risk to the innocent life he sought to preserve. But his father had taught him more than swordwork during those long winter evenings in the great hall. Jarl Thorvald had been a student of strategy, a man who understood that the strongest fortress could be brought down if you knew where to apply pressure. The lessons came back now with crystal clarity: divide your enemies, turn their strengths against them, and always have more than one plan. The outlaws' greatest strength was their numbers and knowledge of the terrain. But numbers could become a weakness if they were spread thin, and local knowledge meant nothing if you could force them to fight on unfamiliar ground. More importantly, Rurik had begun to notice cracks in their apparent unity. Not all of Grim's men were cut from the same cloth. Most were the usual collection of thugs and murderers that such leaders attracted, but a few showed signs of having once been something better. One man in particular caught Rurik's attention, a tall warrior with greying temples who carried himself with the bearing of someone who'd known real discipline. When the others made crude jokes about their prisoner, this man turned away with something that might have been shame. His name was Bjorn, and he wore equipment too fine for a common outlaw. The sword at his side bore the maker's mark of a royal armourer, and his mail shirt showed the careful maintenance of someone who'd learned to respect good gear. More telling still was the way he positioned himself during conversations, always where he could see potential threats, always with clear lines of retreat. These were the habits of a man trained in warfare, not simple banditry. Rurik's instincts told him there was a story there, perhaps one he could use. Men who'd known honor didn't abandon it easily, and someone with Bjorn's apparent background might be reached if the right words were spoken at the right moment. But first, he needed to understand the camp's full layout and the routines that governed it. Through patient observation, he mapped the placement of guards, the timing of their rotations, and the blind spots that darkness would make more pronounced. The outlaws had grown careless in their sense of security, confident that their reputation would keep enemies at bay. Fenja proved invaluable in this reconnaissance. Her enhanced senses revealed hidden caches of supplies, alternate paths through the surrounding forest, and most importantly, the network of caves that riddled the valley walls. The outlaws used some of these caverns for storage, but others appeared to be natural formations that could provide concealment for someone who knew they were there. As the morning progressed, Rurik began to formulate a plan that would use the outlaws' overconfidence against them. Rather than a single bold strike, he would orchestrate a series of smaller actions designed to create confusion and paranoia. Turn them against each other, make them question who could be trusted, and in the chaos that followed, extract both justice and the innocent life that hung in the balance. The key would be patience, something the wilderness had taught him in abundance. Rush in like a berserker, and he'd accomplish nothing but his own death and Astrid's probable murder. But apply pressure gradually, like ice working at stone cracks, and even the strongest foundation could be brought down. He thought of his father's favorite chess strategy, the slow advance that looked like retreat until the moment it became unstoppable. Jarl Thorvald had been a master of such patience, and his son had learned the lesson well during their long games beside the great hall's fire. Now it was time to see if those teachings could serve him in a deadlier game than chess. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Rurik noticed something that made his pulse quicken. Astrid's pendant was glowing more brightly, its amber center pulsing like a tiny heartbeat. She'd noticed it too, and her eyes kept darting toward the forest edge where Rurik lay hidden. Could she sense his presence somehow? Did the old bloodline still carry such gifts? Whether she knew help was coming or not, her courage continued to impress him. Even now, with night approaching and her captors growing restless with drink and boredom, she maintained the dignity of someone who refused to be broken. It reminded him achingly of his sisters, who'd faced their deaths with similar grace. Tonight, he would begin the work that had waited 15 years to be done. Justice would finally come to Skarnfjell, carried on the wind like the promise of winter storms. The attack came at the darkest hour of night, when even the most vigilant sentries fought against sleep. Rurik had waited until the moon set behind the western peaks, leaving the forest wrapped in a blackness so complete that shapes became uncertain and shadows held dominion. It was then that he began his careful infiltration of the outlaw camp, moving like smoke through the maze of crude shelters and dying campfires. His first target was the guard stationed near Astrid's cage, a heavy-set man whose fondness for stolen ale had left him drowsing at his post. Rurik approached from the blind spot he'd identified during his reconnaissance, Fenja ghosting silently at his side. The guard never knew what hit him. One moment he was nodding off against a tree, the next he was unconscious and bound with his own rope. Astrid's eyes went wide as Rurik materialized from the darkness, but her intelligence served her well. Rather than cry out in surprise, she simply watched as he worked to free the crude locks that held her cage shut. Her pendant pulsed more brightly in his presence, its amber heart glowing like a tiny star against her throat. "Who are you?" she whispered as the lock finally yielded to his careful manipulation. "Someone who understands what it means to lose everything to these animals," Rurik replied softly, his voice carrying 15 years of controlled rage. "My name is Rurik Holmgerson, and I've come to set things right." Recognition flickered in her eyes at the name. Even merchant families remembered the great Jarls and the tragedies that had befallen noble houses. "The giant of the roads," she breathed. "The stories about you are probably wrong in the details," he cut her off gently, "but the heart of them is true enough. Can you travel? Are you injured?" Astrid tested her limbs as she emerged from the cage, wincing slightly but moving with determination. "Nothing that won't heal. They were saving me for—" She stopped, her jaw tightening. "It doesn't matter. What matters is that you're here. Stay close and stay quiet," Rurik instructed. "We're leaving, but not the way you might expect." Instead of leading her toward the forest edge, Rurik guided Astrid deeper into the camp. His plan required more than simple rescue. It demanded that Grim's band be thoroughly broken, their power scattered like leaves before a storm. The first phase of that breaking was already in motion. They reached the outlaws' weapon cache without incident, a lean-to structure near the camp center where stolen arms and armor lay piled like trophies. Rurik had identified this target during his scouting, recognizing it as the foundation of the band's confidence. Men who relied on superior equipment could be quickly demoralized if that advantage was removed. Working with silent efficiency, he began sabotaging what he couldn't carry away. Bowstrings were cut, sword blades were notched with careful hammer blows that would cause them to shatter under stress, and arrowheads were loosened until they would fall off at the first shot. It was methodical work, the kind of preparation his father's weapon master had taught him during long afternoons in the armory. Astrid proved surprisingly helpful in this task, her merchant training giving her an eye for quality and weak points that served them well. Her pendant continued to glow softly, and Rurik began to suspect it was responding to more than just his presence. The old bloodlines carried many gifts, and some of them were more practical than others. "My family's pendant has been in our line for generations," she murmured as they worked. "My grandmother said it would glow when ancient powers stirred. I thought it was just a pretty story until tonight." Ancient powers indeed, Rurik thought, remembering the runes on his father's sword and Fenja's uncanny intelligence. The old ways had never truly died in the northern lands. They'd simply learned to be more subtle, hiding in plain sight among those who still remembered. Their sabotage complete, Rurik led Astrid toward the cave system he'd identified earlier. But as they moved through the camp's shadows, disaster struck from an unexpected quarter. One of the outlaws emerged from a shelter at precisely the wrong moment, stumbling toward the latrine pit with the unsteady gait of someone deep in his cups. The man's bleary eyes took a moment to process what he was seeing. Two figures where none should be, moving with purpose through the darkness. When understanding finally dawned, he opened his mouth to raise the alarm. Fenja struck before sound could emerge from his throat. She moved like flowing shadow, covering the distance between them in a bound that seemed to defy natural law. Her jaws closed around the outlaw's neck with crushing force, cutting off his cry before it could wake the camp. But the man's death throes caused him to stumble backward into a stack of wooden crates, sending them crashing to the ground with noise that echoed through the forest like thunder. Shouts erupted from sleeping shelters as outlaws stumbled into wakefulness, their voices rough with confusion and rising alarm. Grim's roar rose above the rest, demanding to know what was happening and threatening dire punishments for whoever had disturbed his sleep. "The plan has changed," Rurik said grimly, his hand moving to his father's sword. "Stay behind me and be ready to run when I give the word." But as torches began to flare throughout the camp and armed figures emerged from the shadows, it became clear that running might not be an option. They were surrounded, caught in the open with dozens of enemies closing in from all sides. The carefully laid plan for stealth and sabotage had crumbled in an instant, leaving them with nothing but steel and courage against overwhelming odds. Grim appeared through the smoke and confusion, his cursed axe gleaming wickedly in the torchlight. His face showed the savage satisfaction of a predator who'd finally cornered dangerous prey. "Well, well," he called across. "The clearing. The giant of the roads comes calling after all, and he's brought me back my property." His eyes fixed on Astrid with possessive hunger. "Did you really think you could waltz into my camp and steal what's mine?" Rurik drew his father's sword, its ruined blade singing as it cleared the scabbard. The weapon seemed to catch and hold the torchlight, its steel glowing with inner fire. Around them, the outlaws formed a tightening circle, but several men hesitated when they saw the legendary weapon in the giant's hands. "Nothing here belongs to you, Grim," Rurik replied, his voice carrying the authority of ancient bloodlines. "And tonight, you pay for what you stole from my family 15 years ago." The circle of torchlight pressed inward like a living thing, casting dancing shadows that made the forest clearing feel like the mouth of some ancient beast. 20 armed outlaws stood ready to strike, their weapons gleaming with oil and murderous intent. At their center, Grim, Bloodaxe, hefted his cursed weapon, its blade seeming to drink the very light from the air around it. "You've made this easier than I expected," Grim sneered, his eyes moving between Rurik and Astrid with predatory satisfaction. "I was wondering how to draw you out of whatever hole you'd crawled into. Turns out all I needed was the right bait." Astrid's pendant flared brighter at the outlaw leader's words, its amber heart pulsing like an angry heart. "You underestimate what you're dealing with, Grim," she said, her voice carrying a strength that surprised even Rurik. "My family didn't survive 3 generations of trading in the deep places by being helpless." Something in her tone made several outlaws shift nervously, their grip tightening on their weapons. The pendant's glow was no longer subtle, it cast its own light now, rivaling the torches and painting everything around them in shades of gold and amber. Power was stirring in the clearing, the kind that made even hardened. Killers remember childhood fears of things that hunted in the dark. Rurik felt the change as well, a tingling in his blood that spoke of awakening gifts he'd thought were nothing more than family legend. His father's sword grew warm in his grip, its ruined blade responding to forces that most men couldn't even sense. The weapon had been more than ceremonial steel, it was a focus, a conduit for the old bloodline's power. "The stories grandmother told were true," he murmured, understanding flooding through him like cold water. "The Jarls weren't just rulers, they were guardians, protectors against things that would corrupt the land itself." Astrid nodded, her merchant's practical nature adapting quickly to revelations that would have sent lesser minds reeling. "My family has been part of that protection for generations, carrying knowledge and warnings to those who still remembered how to listen. The pendant reacts to corruption, to things that shouldn't be allowed to take root. As, if summoned by her words, a low howl echoed through the forest, not the call of any ordinary wolf, but something that spoke of pack loyalty and ancient bonds. Fenja's head lifted in response, her own voice joining the haunting sound. The howl was answered from a dozen different directions, growing closer with each repetition. Grim's face twisted with sudden uncertainty. "What sorcery is this?" he demanded, raising his axe as if the weapon could cut through supernatural forces as easily as flesh. "No sorcery," Rurik replied, his voice carrying new confidence as understanding continued to dawn. "Just the old laws asserting themselves. The forest remembers what it was before your kind poisoned it with cruelty and greed." The first wolf emerged from the tree line. As he spoke, a massive grey beast, nearly as large as Fenja herself, its eyes reflecting the torchlight like pale stars. Another followed, then another, until a dozen supernatural wolves stood at the clearing's edge. They were creatures of legend made flesh, guardians that had slept until the land's need grew too great to ignore. Several outlaws broke ranks at the sight, their nerve finally snapping under the pressure of forces they couldn't understand or fight. But Grim's voice cracked like a whip, calling them back with threats and promises of shared wealth. His cursed axe pulsed with darker energy, as if it fed on the fear and violence that filled the air. "Stand your ground, you cowards," he roared. "They're just beasts, and beasts can be killed like anything else." He turned his burning gaze on Rurik. "And you're just a man with a sword, no matter what bloodline you claim." The battle erupted without further warning. Grim's axe swept through the air in a deadly arc, its blade trailing darkness like a comet's tail. Rurik met the attack with his father's sword, and when the two weapons clashed, the sound was like thunder breaking over the mountains. Sparks of gold and shadow flew from the impact, and several outlaws stumbled backward from the wave of power that washed over the clearing. Around them, chaos bloomed as the supernatural wolves engaged the outlaws. These were not ordinary predators. They moved with intelligence and coordination that spoke of higher purpose. Fenja led them like a general commanding troops, her tactical mind evident in every coordinated strike. But it was Bjorn's response that surprised Rurik most. The greying warrior stood frozen for a heartbeat as the battle raged around him, his hand on his sword, but his weapon still sheathed. When one of his fellow outlaws raised a blade toward Astrid's back, Bjorn moved, but not in the direction anyone expected. His sword took the attacker in the ribs with surgical precision, dropping the man before he could complete his strike. Then Bjorn was moving toward Rurik and Astrid, his fine blade cutting a path through the confusion with the skill of someone trained in real warfare. "Enough!" he called, over the sounds of battle. "I've had enough of this madness." Grim spun toward his lieutenant with fury and betrayal written across his scarred features. "Bjorn, what are you doing?" "What I should have done years ago," the older warrior replied, placing himself between the outlaw leader and his intended victims. "My name is Bjorn Eriksson, and I remember what honor meant before I let grief and anger cloud my judgment." The revelation hit Rurik like a physical blow. Eriksson, his mother's family name, the cousin who'd supposedly died in the same raid that destroyed his own family, lost in the burning chaos when the halls fell. But here he stood, alive and fighting at Rurik's side, after 15 years of thinking himself the last of his bloodline. "Bjorn?" Rurik breathed, recognition flooding through him despite the years and hardships that had changed them both. "Cousin?" Understanding passed between them in that instant. Shared grief, shared loss, and shared purpose finally. Reunited. They stood back to back as Grim's remaining followers pressed inward, their weapons singing harmony as they fought with the coordination of family that had trained together in better days. The battle's tide was turning, but its outcome remained far from certain. Ancient powers stirred in the darkness beyond the torchlight, and somewhere in the chaos, destiny was writing the final chapter of a story that had begun with fire and blood 15 years before. The truth came like lightning splitting the night sky, illuminating everything in stark, terrible clarity. Bjorn's sword moved with the fluid grace of noble training, its blade inscribed with runes that gleamed silver in the torchlight. But it was when Grim's cursed axe struck the weapon that revelation struck harder than any physical blow. The ancient sword blazed with pure light, so bright that every man in the clearing had to shield his eyes. When the radiance faded, the weapon hummed with power that made the very air vibrate. "That blade," Astrid gasped, her pendant pulsing in rhythm with the sword's energy. "It's one of the guardian weapons. My grandmother told me stories, swords that could only be wielded by those of true honor, forged in the old times when the boundaries between worlds were thinner." Grim stumbled backward, his cursed axe smoking where it had touched Bjorn's blessed steel. "Impossible," he snarled. "You're nothing but a broken outlaw, just like the rest of us." "No," Bjorn replied, his voice carrying the weight of long-buried truth. "I am Bjorn Eriksson, son of Jarl Erik the Bold, cousin to Rurik Holmgerson. I thought I was the last of our bloodline when the darkness came for our families. I thought honor had died with them." Rurik felt the world tilt beneath his feet as memories cascaded through his mind. Childhood summers, when Bjorn had visited their hall, their mock sword battles in the training yard, the way Bjorn had always stood up for the smaller children when the older boys grew too rough. His cousin had been like a brother to him, and losing him in the same night that took everything else had been a wound that never properly healed. "The raid," Rurik whispered. "Your father's hall burned the same night as mine. I searched the ruins, but I wasn't there," Bjorn finished, his expression heavy with old shame. "I was hunting in the high country when the attack came. By the time I returned, everything was ash and bone. I found my father's body in the great hall, still clutching his sword." His jaw tightened. "That's when the darkness found me." The battle had paused around them as supernatural forces sensed the weight of revelation. Even the outlaws seemed frozen, their crude understanding recognizing that something momentous was unfolding before them. The mystical wolves formed a protective circle, their pale eyes reflecting an intelligence that went far beyond animal cunning. "The entity spoke to me that night," Bjorn continued, his voice growing distant with memory. "It promised revenge, promised the power to track down our family's killers. I thought it was my own rage, my own desire for justice. I didn't understand until much later that I was being used." Astrid's eyes widened with sudden understanding. "The corruption," she breathed. "Your pendant isn't just responding to Grim's axe, it's responding to something much older, much more dangerous." As if summoned by her words, the shadows at the clearing's edge began to writhe and coalesce. The temperature dropped until their breath misted in the suddenly frigid air, and the torches flickered as if an unfelt wind sought to extinguish them. When the darkness took shape, it towered above them all, a thing of shadow and malice that had worn Grim's ambitions like a comfortable coat. Finally, the entity spoke through Grim's mouth, but the voice was something older than human civilization. "The last guardians gather in one place. How convenient I can eliminate you all at once and complete what was begun 15 years ago." Understanding crashed over Rurik like a tide of ice water. "The raids weren't random. You orchestrated them. You wanted our families dead. The guardian bloodlines had grown too strong." The entity hissed, its borrowed voice filled with ancient malice. "Too many were remembering the old ways. Too many were teaching their children to watch for signs of corruption. Better to remove the threat before it could mature." Grim's body began to change as the entity's true power manifested. His limbs stretched, and his muscles bulged with unnatural strength, while his eyes burned with fires that had never known mortal flame. The cursed axe in his hands grew larger and darker, its blade drinking light from everything around it. "But some children escaped," the creature continued, savoring the revelation. "And children grow up to seek revenge. So I used that revenge, twisted it, made it serve my purposes." Young Bjorn was so easy to manipulate, so hungry for justice, that he couldn't see how his noble quest was being perverted. Bjorn's face went white with horror as the full scope of his manipulation became clear. "The information that led me to the outlaws. The way I always seemed to arrive just after they'd committed their worst atrocities. You were guiding me, using me to spread fear and chaos, and using you to gather them here, the entity confirmed. Building a power base in these forgotten woods, where my influence could grow strong enough to manifest directly. You thought you were hunting monsters, boy. You never realized you were helping create them. The revelation hit Rurik like a physical blow. His cousin hadn't just survived, he'd been turned into an unwitting agent of the very force that had destroyed their families. For 15 years, Bjorn had believed he was fighting evil while actually serving it, his noble intentions twisted into tools of corruption. "The sword chose you tonight," Astrid said suddenly, her voice cutting through the despair that threatened to overwhelm them all. "Despite everything you've done, despite how you've been used, the blade of your ancestors still recognizes your true heart. That has to mean something." She was right. The guardian sword continued to blaze with pure light, its radiance growing stronger rather than dimmer as the entity's true nature revealed itself. The weapon was rejecting the corruption that had tainted its wielder, burning away years of manipulation and false purpose. It means he can still choose. Rurik realized, hope flickering to life in his chest. The entity used his grief and anger, but it never truly owned his soul. The sword proves that. Bjorn straightened, his grip tightening on the blessed weapon. Around them, the mystical wolves began to howl in harmonious chorus, their voices carrying across the forest like a call to arms. In the distance, other sounds answered, the rustle of awakening trees, the whisper of streams changing course, the deep groan of stone responding to forces older than memory. "The land itself is choosing sides," Astrid whispered in amazement. "The old compact is reasserting itself." The entity that wore Grimm's shape snarled with fury, its plans unraveling as ancient powers stirred from their long sleep. "No matter. I have strength enough to crush you all, and when you're dead, nothing will stand between me and the corruption of this entire region." But as the creature raised its massive axe for the killing blow, 3 guardian descendants stood ready to meet it, armed with blessed weapons, protected by supernatural allies, and united by bonds that no amount of darkness could truly break. The real battle was about to begin. The forest itself seemed to draw breath as the 3 guardian descendants faced the manifested corruption that had haunted their bloodline for generations. Around them, reality warped under the weight of opposing forces, ancient protective magic clashing against primordial malice that sought to devour everything pure in the world. Astrid stepped forward, her merchant's practical mind already cataloguing their resources and weaknesses. "The entity draws its power from this place," she said, her pendant blazing like a small sun against her throat. 15 years of fear and violence have fed it, made it strong enough to take physical form, but that also makes it vulnerable. Rurik nodded grimly, his father's sword humming with barely contained energy. The weapon seemed eager for battle, its runed blade casting patterns of light that made the surrounding shadows recoil. The old stories spoke of anchor points, places where such creatures tethered themselves to our world. If we can find it, we can banish it back to whatever darkness spawned it. Bjorn finished, his own guardian blade, singing harmony with his cousin's weapon. Despite everything he'd endured, despite the years of manipulation and false purpose, his tactical mind remained sharp. But it won't be defenseless. Look around us. The corrupted outlaws were changing, their forms twisting under the entity's influence into something barely recognizable as human. Their weapons grew larger and more wicked, while their eyes burned with the same unholy fire that blazed from Grimm's transformed features. They moved with purpose now, no longer the crude bandits they'd been, but extensions of an ancient will bent on destruction. 12 of them left, Rurik counted, his warrior's eye assessing the threat. Plus, whatever Grimm has become, poor odds, even with our advantages. Not just poor impossible, Astrid corrected. Unless we change the nature of the battlefield itself, She turned to the mystical wolves that surrounded them, her voice taking on an odd resonance that seemed to bypass normal hearing and speak directly to their supernatural intelligence. "You remember the old compact, don't you? The agreement between your kind and the Guardian bloodlines?" Fenja stepped forward, her massive form crackling with silver energy that made her grey coat shimmer like moonlight on water. When she spoke, it was not with words, but with images and emotions that flowed directly into their minds, memories of ancient oaths, of promises made when the world was young and the boundaries between realms were gossamer thin. The other wolves responded in kind, their collective consciousness sharing knowledge that had been passed down through pack memories for countless generations. They showed images of standing stones arranged in careful patterns, of ritual sites where the Guardian families had once performed ceremonies to strengthen the barriers between worlds. There, Astrid pointed toward a rise in the forest floor where ancient granite pushed through the earth like the bones of sleeping giants. "The old circle. It's still active. I can feel the power humming beneath the corruption." Bjorn squinted through the supernatural chaos surrounding them. 100 yards through enemy territory. We'll never reach it alive, not with all of them between us and the stones." "We don't all need to reach it," Rurik realized, understanding blooming in his mind like dawn breaking over mountains. "The ritual requires 3 parts: anchor, focus, and catalyst. The stones are the anchor. Our bloodline weapons provide the focus. But the catalyst has to be willing sacrifice." Astrid finished, her face going pale as she grasped the implications. "One of us has to stay behind, hold them off while the others complete the binding, and whoever does that won't survive it," Bjorn said quietly. "I know something about sacrifices. I've been preparing for this one for 15 years without realizing it. No." Rurik's voice carried the absolute authority of someone accustomed to command. "You've been robbed of 15 years by that creature's lies. I won't let you throw away the rest of your life for my family's vendetta." "Our family's vendetta," Bjorn corrected firmly. "And it's not throwing away anything. It's finally doing something worthwhile with a life that lost its meaning the night our halls burned." He hefted his guardian sword, its blessed light painting determination across his weathered features. "Besides, someone has to stay with the wolves and coordinate their attack. You two are the ones with the real magical training. I'm just a broken warrior who finally found his purpose." Before either of them could protest, the entity wearing Grimm's flesh let loose, a roar that shattered trees and sent rocks tumbling from the surrounding cliffs. "Enough delay. You cannot escape what has been written in shadow and blood. Your bloodlines end tonight, and with them the last hope of this land's salvation." The corrupted outlaws surged forward like a tide of living darkness, their weapons trailing streamers of shadow that poisoned the very air. But the mystical wolves met them with supernatural fury, fangs and claws that blazed with silver fire, tearing through corrupted flesh and spirit alike. Fenja led the pack with tactical brilliance, her intelligence directing the assault with precision that would have impressed any military commander. "Now!" Bjorn shouted over the chaos, his blade carving through the nearest attacker in a shower of sparks. "Get to the circle. I'll buy you the time you need." Rurik wanted to argue, wanted to find another way, but Astrid's hand on his arm stopped him. Her merchant's wisdom recognized necessity when she saw it, and her pendant was pulsing with urgent rhythm that spoke of rapidly diminishing time. "He's right," she said simply. "We have to trust him to do what needs doing, just like he has to trust us to make it count." They ran through the supernatural battlefield like figures from legend, Rurik's massive sword clearing a path, while Astrid's pendant blazed bright enough to make the corrupted creatures stumble and shield their eyes. Behind them, Bjorn's guardian blade sang its deadly song as he wove between attackers with the fluid grace of someone who'd finally found his true calling. The ancient stone circle rose before them like a crown of granite thorns, each monolith carved with runes so old that even scholars had forgotten their meaning. But the symbols responded to their approach, beginning to glow with soft radiance that grew stronger as Rurik and Astrid drew near. The stones remembered their purpose, remembered the oaths sworn in their shadow when the world was younger and magic flowed more freely through all living things. "Here," Astrid called, pointing to the circle's center where a flat altar stone lay inscribed with spiraling patterns. "This is where the binding has to happen. Place your sword there, and I'll begin the invocation." Rurik hesitated, his warrior's instincts screaming warnings about leaving himself unarmed in the middle of a battle. But Astrid's pendant was blazing like a star now, and he could feel the ancient power building around them with each passing heartbeat. This was larger than personal combat, larger than individual survival. He placed his father's sword on the altar stone, and immediately the entire circle erupted in pillars of golden light that reached toward the storm-racked sky. The runes carved into each monolith blazed with fire that didn't burn, while the very air hummed with forces that predated human civilization. Astrid began to speak, but the words that came from her lips were not in any language Rurik recognized. They were older than speech, older than conscious thought, the fundamental syllables that had shaped the world when it was new and malleable. Her pendant rose from her chest to float before her face, casting patterns of light that made reality itself seem to ripple and bend. Behind them, Bjorn's battle cry echoed through the forest as he made his stand against impossible odds. His guardian sword blazed like a falling star as he danced between corrupted attackers, each strike of his blade burning away another piece of the entity's earthly power. The mystical wolves fought beside him with supernatural coordination, their pack tactics keeping him alive against enemies that should have overwhelmed him in moments. But even legends had limits, and Rurik could see his cousin beginning to falter under the relentless assault. Blood stained Bjorn's mail, where claws and blades had found their mark, and his movements were growing slower despite the blessed weapon's power. "Hurry," Rurik urged, his heart breaking as he watched his newly found family prepare to sacrifice himself for their cause. "He can't hold them much longer." "Almost there," Astrid replied through gritted teeth, sweat beading on her forehead as she wrestled with forces that could burn out a human mind if mishandled. "The binding is taking hold, but the entity knows what we're doing. It's fighting back with everything it has." Indeed, the creature that wore Grimm's flesh was forcing its way through the supernatural battle toward the stone circle, its massive axe trailing darkness that devoured the very light around it. Each step it took left the ground cracked and poisoned, while its roar of fury made the ancient stones themselves tremble. The final confrontation was at hand, and only one question remained: would they complete the binding before the entity's rage destroyed them all? The entity's corruption stone blazed from within the twisted mass that had once been Grimm's chest, a dark crystal that pulsed like a diseased heart, anchoring the ancient evil to the physical world. As the creature forced its way toward the stone circle, reality warped around it, trees withering at its touch, and the very earth cracking beneath its feet. "There!" Astrid shouted over the supernatural storm, pointing at the crystal even as her incantation continued to flow from her lips. "That's what's keeping it bound to our realm. If we can destroy it, the entity goes back to whatever pit spawned it." Rurik finished, understanding flooding through him. But the corruption stone was embedded deep within the creature's transformed flesh, protected by layers of supernatural armor and malevolent will. The mystical wolves launched themselves at the entity in coordinated waves, their silver fire fangs seeking gaps in its defenses. Fenja led the assault with tactical brilliance that would have impressed any war leader, but even their supernatural claws couldn't penetrate the darkness that surrounded their enemy like living shadow. Bjorn appeared through the chaos, his guardian blade trailing streams of blessed light as he carved through the remaining corrupted outlaws. Blood ran freely from a dozen wounds, but his eyes burned with purpose that had been absent for 15 years. "The crystal!" he called. "I can reach it, but I need a clear shot." "No," Rurik started toward his cousin, but Astrid's hand on his arm stopped him cold. "Don't break the circle," she warned, her voice strained with the effort of maintaining the binding ritual. "One step outside these stones and the whole working collapses. The entity will be free to corrupt the entire region." The choice tore at Rurik's heart: save his newly found family, or complete the mission that could save countless innocent lives. It was the kind of decision that defined character, the moment when a man discovered what he truly valued above all else. The entity, sensing his hesitation, laughed with cruel satisfaction. "Choose quickly, last guardian. Watch your cousin die while you cower behind ancient stones, or abandon your duty and let darkness reclaim what was always mine." Bjorn solved the dilemma in the way that warriors throughout history had settled such impossible choices, through decisive action that left no room for regret. His guardian sword blazed brighter than a fallen star as he charged directly at the entity's corruption stone, his battle cry echoing through the forest like thunder. The creature's massive axe swept down to meet him, its blade trailing shadows that sought to devour both light and life. But Bjorn was no longer the broken outlaw who'd wandered the wilderness for 15 years. He was a guardian, reclaiming his birthright, and his sword carried the weight of ancestral oaths. Steel met darkness in an explosion that lit the entire clearing. The blessed blade sheared through the entity's supernatural defenses, its runes blazing with power that made the very air sing. For one impossible moment, Bjorn's weapon pressed against the corruption stone, divine fire warring with primordial malice. The crystal cracked. The entity's roar of fury and pain shook the ancient trees to their roots, while cracks spread across the corruption stone like lightning frozen in dark amber. But the creature's counterstrike came with the desperate fury of something facing extinction. The cursed axe found its mark, biting deep into Bjorn's side and lifting him from his feet. He crashed into the base of a standing stone with bone-jarring force, his guardian sword spinning away into the darkness. Blood pooled beneath him as he struggled to rise, his face grey with pain and shock. "Bjorn!" Rurik's anguished cry cut through the supernatural chaos, but his cousin raised one trembling hand to forestall any rescue attempt. "Finish it!" Bjorn gasped, his eyes fixed on the corruption stone with its spreading network of cracks. Complete the binding while the crystal is weakened." Astrid's incantation reached its crescendo, her pendant burning like a captive star as power beyond mortal comprehension flowed through the ancient stone circle. The monoliths themselves began to sing, their runes blazing with light that pushed back the encroaching darkness. Reality bent and twisted around the ritual's focus, while forces older than civilization warred for dominance. But the entity wasn't finished. Sensing the binding taking hold, it abandoned all pretense of tactics and hurled itself bodily at the stone circle. Its massive form crashed against the barrier of light that protected the ritual, causing the entire structure to shake and flicker. "The circle won't hold much longer," Astrid warned, blood running from her nose as the magical backlash took its toll. "Whatever you're going to do," Fenja's howl cut through her words, a sound that spoke of more than animal loyalty. The great wolf was gathering the last of her supernatural strength, her silver fire blazing brighter than ever before. She looked once at Rurik with eyes that held 15 years of shared memories, then launched herself at the corruption stone with the fury of a falling star. Her sacrifice struck home just as the entity's axe swept down to end her leap forever. Fenja's sacrifice shattered the corruption stone like glass breaking against granite, her supernatural essence burning through the dark crystal's heart with purifying fire. The entity's scream of anguish split the night as its anchor to the physical world crumbled, its carefully constructed form beginning to waver and fade. But even dying gods could strike terrible blows, and the cursed axe completed its arc through Fenja's brave heart. She fell beside the altar stone, where Rurik's father's sword still blazed with guardian fire, her silver eyes meeting his one last time before the light within them dimmed forever. "No," Rurik whispered, the word torn from his soul like a physical wound. 15 years of shared memories crashed over him, the terrified pup he'd saved from his family's burning hall, the loyal companion who'd never left his side through all their wandering years, the supernatural guardian who'd protected him from dangers both seen and unseen. Grief and rage combined in his heart like opposing storms, but it was love that proved stronger than either. Love for the wolf who'd been more family than pet. Love for the cousin who'd sacrificed everything for redemption. Love for the innocent lives that still hung in the balance. Rurik stepped from the stone circle. "The ritual!" Astrid cried out in alarm, but he was already moving, his massive hands closing around his father's sword with purpose that burned brighter than supernatural fire. The guardian blade sang as it left the altar, its runes blazing with power that responded to its wielder's need. "Some things matter more than safety," he said simply, advancing on the entity with the steady pace of approaching judgment. "Some oaths transcend ritual and binding. My family's blood cries out for justice, and I will answer that call." The entity's form was becoming unstable without its corruption stone, darkness bleeding away like smoke in strong wind. But it still possessed enough power to kill, still carried the malice of eons, spent plotting the destruction of everything good and clean. "You cannot defeat me," it hissed through Grimm's failing vocal cords. "I am eternal darkness, the shadow that existed before the first light. Your little sword cannot." Rurik's blade took Grimm's possessed head from his shoulders in a single clean stroke. The cursed axe fell from nerveless fingers as the entity's stolen flesh collapsed, but the ancient evil wasn't finished yet. Without physical form to contain it, the darkness began to spread like poison through the clearing, seeking new hosts among the remaining corrupted outlaws. "The binding!" Astrid shouted, her hands weaving patterns of light that fought to contain the spreading corruption. "I can't complete it alone." Bjorn struggled to his feet despite his grievous wounds, his hand closing around the guardian's sword that had fallen beside him. Blood ran freely from his side, but his eyes burned with determination that had been purified by sacrifice. "Together," he gasped, "the way it should have been 15 years ago." The 3 guardian descendants raised their weapons as one, their blades forming a triangle of blazing light that pierced the supernatural darkness. Power flowed between them, not just the magic of ancient bloodlines, but something deeper and more fundamental. Love that transcended death, loyalty that outlasted betrayal, courage that faced impossible odds without flinching. The entity's formless darkness recoiled from their combined radiance, its ancient malice meeting something it had never truly understood: the willingness of mortals to sacrifice everything for principles greater than personal survival. By blood and blade, by oath and honor. Rurik intoned, the words coming from racial memory deeper than conscious thought. "By the compact sworn when the world was young, we banish you from this realm. By sacrifice freely given and love freely shared," Astrid continued, her pendant blazing like a star reborn. "By the price paid in tears and toil, we cast you into outer just darkness. By redemption earned through suffering," Bjorn finished, his voice growing stronger despite his wounds. "By the grace that transforms the fallen, we deny you purchase in our world." The 3 guardian blades struck as one, their combined light forming a spear of pure radiance that pierced the entity's essence like lightning splitting storm clouds. The ancient darkness convulsed, its substance unraveling as the binding took hold and dragged it back toward whatever hellish dimension had spawned it. But the entity's final words carried across the clearing with prophetic weight. "This is not over, guardians. Others will come, drawn by the scent of your bloodline's power. Your victory tonight merely delays the inevitable darkness." Then it was gone, banished back to the spaces between worlds, leaving only the corruption it had already spread to mark its passage. The remaining outlaws collapsed as their supernatural transformation reversed, some dead, others merely unconscious as their humanity reasserted itself. Silence fell over the ancient stone circle like a shroud, broken only by the crackling of dying fires and the whisper of wind through battle-scarred trees. The immediate threat was ended, but victory had come at a price that would haunt the survivors forever. Beside the altar stone, Fenja's silver form lay still and peaceful, her sacrifice having saved them all at the cost of her own magnificent life. 3 months later, Rurik knelt beside a cairn of carefully chosen stones in the heart of what had once been Grimm's stronghold. The memorial rose from earth that had been cleansed of corruption, its granite blocks carved with runes that would endure long after those who raised it had passed into legend. At its peak, a crystal of pure amber caught the morning light, not a corruption stone, but something that honored life rather than devouring it. Fenja, faithful companion, he read aloud from the inscription he'd carved with his own hands. Who chose love over safety, courage over comfort, sacrifice over survival. The forest remembers. The wolves remember. We remember. The words seemed inadequate for everything she'd been: protector, friend, the last link to his lost childhood. But inadequate words were all mortals had for grief that ran deeper than language could reach. Astrid approached from the rebuilt settlement, her merchant's dress replaced by the practical garb of someone who'd chosen a harder path. Her pendant still hung at her throat, but its glow had settled into something peaceful rather than urgent, the calm vigilance of a sentinel who knew her watch might be long, but not lonely. "The survivors from Grimm's band are asking about winter quarters," she reported, settling beside him on the sun-warmed stone. Most of them seemed genuinely repentant, but a few still carry the kind of anger that could fester if left untended. Rurik nodded thoughtfully. Redemption was possible for those willing to embrace it, but the choice had to come from within. Some men could be saved from their own darkness. Others had to be contained until they found the strength to save themselves. "Bjorn's judgment is sound in such matters," he said. "Let him decide who stays and who must seek their fortunes elsewhere. He understands both the weight of past sins and the possibility of future grace." His cousin had recovered well from his wounds, though he would carry scars that served as permanent reminders of the price of redemption. More importantly, he'd found peace with his past and purpose for his future. The broken outlaw who'd wandered the wilderness for 15 years had died in the stone circle. What emerged was something both older and newer. A guardian who understood that protection sometimes required harsh choices. "The traders from Ironhold arrived this morning," Astrid continued. "They brought word from the southern settlements. Strange things stirring in the deep forests, travelers, reporting dreams of ancient voices calling their names. The entity's warning about others coming may prove prophetic," Rurik finished. "But that's tomorrow's burden. Today, we honor those who fell and celebrate those who survived." The forest around them showed signs of healing that went beyond the merely natural. Trees that had withered under corruption were putting out new growth. Streams ran clearer than they had in years, and wildlife had returned to regions that had been barren for too long. The wolves, Fenja's pack, though none could truly replace their fallen leader, had taken up residence in the deeper woods, serving as early warning against threats both mundane and supernatural. Children played among the settlement's new buildings, their laughter carrying on the wind like music composed of pure joy. Most were the offspring of reformed outlaws who'd chosen honest labor over banditry, but some belonged to merchants and craftsmen drawn by word that the Skarnfjell road was safe again. Where once fear had ruled, hope was taking tentative root. "I've been thinking about what my grandmother used to say," Astrid mused, her eyes distant with memory. She claimed that every generation produces exactly the guardians it needs, not necessarily the ones it wants, but the ones required to face whatever darkness the times demand. Wise woman, Rurik replied, though I suspect she never imagined her granddaughter would choose the guardian path herself. Astrid's smile held depths that spoke of decisions made and prices accepted. Someone has to carry the knowledge forward. The old ways are stirring again, which means people will need teachers who understand what's coming. Besides, her expression grew playful. Someone has to keep you and Bjorn from taking unnecessary risks. Through the trees came the sound of approaching footsteps, and Bjorn emerged from the forest with a patrol of reformed outlaws. His bearing had changed since the night in the stone. Circled straighter, more confident, touched with the authority of someone who'd found his proper place in the world's order. The northern borders are secure, he reported. No sign of supernatural incursion, and the last of the purely criminal elements have moved on to easier territories. We've had 3 merchant caravans pass through this week without incident. And the survivors from our own bands? Rurik asked. Adapting well, for the most part. Hard work and honest purpose tend to burn away the poison that drew them to outlawry in the first place. Bjorn's expression grew thoughtful, though I sometimes wonder if we're being naive, thinking people can change so completely. People can change, Astrid said firmly. You're living proof of that. The question isn't whether redemption is possible, it's whether individuals are willing to embrace the difficult work it requires. As evening approached, the 3 guardians made their way back to the settlement's heart, where cooking fires sent welcome smoke into the darkening sky. The community they'd helped build was small and fragile, but it carried something precious, proof that darkness could be driven back, that corruption could be cleansed, that hope could take root even in the most barren soil. Rurik paused at the settlement's edge to look back at Fenja's memorial, its amber crystal catching the last light of day. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats to face and overcome. The entity's warning about others coming had not been idle already. Reports filtered in from distant regions of strange happenings and ancient powers stirring. But tonight they had earned rest. Tonight they could remember the fallen, celebrate the living, and prepare for whatever battles lay ahead. The guardian bloodlines had been tested and proven strong, forged anew in sacrifice and tempered by love that transcended loss. In the growing darkness, amber light pulsed gently, eternal reminder that some bonds could not be broken by death itself.